you were asked by President Bush to run for a Senate seat in Illinois, a U.S. Senate seat that was becoming vacant. And you declined to run for that seat as a Republican candidate. You wouldn't say this, but I would say that Edgar, had he run for that seat, would have won that seat. When he left the governorship, he was very popular. He actually is still as popular in Illinois. He didn't run for that seat. Who was elected to that seat?
Some state senator named Barack Obama.
Barack Obama was elected to that seat. And, you know, that's what history hinges on. Had Edgar run, I don't think Barack Obama would have had a chance. And without being in the United States Senate, it's unlikely that Barack Obama would have run for or been elected president. So all of these contingencies, all of these ifs, all of,
you know. I mean, you never know. Never know. After he made that speech at the convention, I'm not sure I could have beat him. But I used to have a lot of people call and complain to me when Obama got elected president, saying, if you'd have run. And I said, well, if I'd have run, Hillary Clinton would have been president. And they used to work with the Republicans until about the second year of the Obama term. And then they said, well, we think we'd rather have her than him. So, but for a long time, I could get away with it because of the alternative was Hillary Clinton. And most Republicans didn't like that. But now they would take her, I think, over Barack Obama. At least
but if they had Hillary, they would
have been
pushing for Barack
right.
Obama.
Oh, yeah.
Right. You Republicans are never satisfied,
right.
Are you?
No.
Okay. This is Jim Edgar is here for a meeting at Eagleton, which will take place later today and into tomorrow morning. And he was kind enough to agree to, come to this class. It seemed appropriate since this class is on governors, legislatures, and policy making. When I was thinking about writing a book on governors as policy-making leaders, the first person I talked to, I went out and visited Jim in Champaign, Illinois, where he is currently on the faculty of the University of Illinois and the Champaign campus. And I talked to him, interviewed him about governors and their policy agendas and their budgets and what have you, and had a very long conversation. And since that time, I've been interviewing or surveying other governors and reading memoirs and, going further in my study of governors. What I've asked Jim to do, and he's agreed to do it, this is the last session we have. Next week, there's the exam. Today, you will, give me your papers, next week you come in and there'll be 3-hour exams, you'll be at tables, you'll get lunch, as I mentioned, and what have you. But today I'd like to try to pull together some strands of the course about legislatures and governors and, kind of how they do their jobs. And I asked Jim if he would just sort of kind of respond to the points I'm making about legislatures, and then particularly about governors, but also about legislatures, since he was in the legislature, and he obviously saw the Illinois legislature, from close hand when he was Secretary of State and when he was governor. And I wanted him to kind of, put in his 2 cents or 5 cents or, more on some of the points I'm making. So I thought what we'd do is spend maybe about an hour, with me kind of summarizing about legislatures and about what I think the problems are that legislatures are facing today. And, Jim would add, and, his perspective is a heck of a lot better than mine. Then we'd take a break, and then we'd come back and talk about governors in the sense that I would love Jim to respond to my findings, which are now there. I'm just about finished a draft of the book about governors and how and why governors succeed as policy leaders. And I think he's likely to agree with much of of what I say. I know that from our interview and what I found out from other governors, but I think it would be useful to get his perspective on my meanderings. So that's basically. Is that okay?
That'll be fine.
Is that okay? If you look at what the public thinks of legislatures, and some governors certainly, but legislatures as institutions, the public assessment of legislatures is very low. The fact that 19 or 20 states, I think, the public passed term limits on a referendum under an initiative process. The fact that many states, majorities of citizens, voted to limit the terms of legislators is not an endorsement of the first branch of government, the legislature. When people are asked if it would be and they have been asked on surveys, whether they think it would be a good idea if citizens voted directly on the issues, more people think citizens should vote directly than think that's not a good idea. In other words, if people had their way, they would pretty much get rid of legislatures and have popular referendums. I mean, going further probably than in those states that have the initiative and referendum, such as California, Oregon, Arizona, and others. So there isn't much confidence today, and this has been going on for some years in state legislatures. And we've been through a lot about state legislatures, about representation, about advocacy by interest groups and lobbyists. And I think basically I want to summarize here by asking the question, how well do legislatures generally work? Generally, you've got to look at each legislature differently, and you've got to look at each legislature separately and at different points of time. But I'm trying to generalize about the system generally. How well do they work at what I consider to be their major jobs? Would you agree that the major jobs of legislatures are representing people, that representational job? And there are two aspects of that job, I think, Jim. One is what I call serving their interests, and that means identifying with them, giving them access, listening to their beefs, doing casework for citizens, getting around, connecting them with government, and getting projects for the district, protecting the local aid formulas, and satisfying those interests that people have and districts have. The second part of representation, I think, is that of basically expressing their views, expressing the views of people in the district. Now, on most issues that legislatures deal with, people don't have views. I mean, they're under the radar issues, they're narrow scope issues, and people don't think about those issues. But on the big issues, taxation, capital punishment, abortion, pretty much people represent the views, of those people in the district. And I think that's largely because, Democrats elect Democrats and Republican districts elect Republicans, and there tends to be, some commonality in views. But so representing is a first job. Would you say that's?
Oh no, I think I'm going to go back a little bit.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that if you ask people about government in general, they have a low opinion. I don't think they maybe have any lower opinion of the state legislature than they do Congress.
No.
In fact, they might not have they don't think about state legislatures as much as they think about Congress, so it's not quite as low. But the interesting thing is for state legislators and to a great extent for congressmen, if you ask them about their own legislator, they have a higher opinion because they have dealings. But there's just something about this institution or government and they had to pay taxes or something like that they don't like. So there's no doubt there is this kind of negative attitude, but I think an individual legislator, if he or she does their job well, they can be pretty well thought of, at least in political terms. I mean, it's very difficult, short of redistricting, or a major landslide, or a shift in the country's attitude, is we kind of had in this last election for incumbent legislators to lose. And I think the same is true for Congress. Now, we saw some lose this last time, both at the state and federal level, because this was a major shift in public opinion. You have to go back to '94 to see, I think, as big a shift, at least for Republicans in a positive sense. So there's no doubt people do have a negative attitude. I'll never forget when I left the legislature, and I always wanted to be a legislator. I thought, gee, this is important. You know, people really ought to look up to me. And all my friends came up and said, we're so glad you got out of that job, you know. And I went to work for the governor, and I thought, I was really surprised. But people, I have to say, don't hold legislators on the pedestal up as I thought they did. But back to your other point about representation. Yeah. Legislators, to a fault, do representation. In fact, I think if there is a shortcoming among state legislators, is that all they do is represent what they think their district wants, not necessarily what their district needs. I just spoke to the new members orientation conference about 2 weeks ago in Illinois. And every 2 years I do that, and I always remind them, I said, you are a state legislator. Now, true, you've got to represent your district, you get elected by a district, but you also have to keep in mind what's best for the entire state. And that, I think, is the biggest stumbling block for legislators. Because
what I would argue is that legislatures and legislators do a splendid job of representation. And, you know, in letter terms, I'd give them an A on representation. But on responsiveness, on being responsive to what the people back home want and what is in their interests. But on responsibility, and I think responsibility is a kind of a clashing value. They're more responsive than responsible. So in trying to make everybody happy, you know, states as well as the federal government have built up a massive debt because you want to keep taxes down and you want to keep services up. And legislators just are inclined to want to make people happy. I think it's, partly, that's the way they get reelected, and it's partly they just sort of have that mentality. You too would want to make people happy rather than people angry. So one of the major problems, I think, with legislatures today, and that includes Congress, is that there's greater responsiveness to what people seem to want than there is this kind of responsibility for future generations, for the nation as a whole, for the state as a whole. Is that?
I don't think there's any doubt. In fact, all politicians want to be loved. I mean, that's why we're in it to some extent. Now, we also want to change the world, maybe, but we also have egos. Now, it's not the only profession that has egos, but politicians have pretty healthy egos, and you want people to like you. You want people to think you're good, not only to get reelected, which is very important in the eyes of most politicians, but it's just in their nature. It's just kind of in their DNA, the kind of people they are. And so it's really hard for politicians, elected officials, to tell people no. And as a result, if you don't tell people no, that's why we have a lot of these budget deficits in states. They didn't want to make people mad, so they didn't want to tell them no, and they also didn't want to raise taxes to pay for what they just gave the people. And so that's a real challenge, but it's I think that's one of the real problems with most people in politics is it's just tough for them to do things that are going to make people mad. There's one last thing. There's an old thing about politicians have thick skin. That's not true. I've never met a politician with thick skin. We all had thin skin. That's kind of because we want to be loved. We don't like criticism. And so you don't want people out there upset. I don't know how many times as governor I'd go to legislators and say, this bill, you got to, before this is important. He says, no, I'm going to make these groups mad back in my district. I just don't want to listen to them. And that's part of the dilemma.
But the interesting thing, and we'll get to this later maybe, is that governors are also politicians, but they tend to be more responsible. And they tend to be more responsible, I think, because they're one. they take responsibility because they are the statewide elected official that's supposed to initiate policy and what have you. Whereas legislators, can take responsibility for their districts, but for the product of the legislature, they share responsibility with, a lot of people and in a lot of different ways. So it's the difference between, I think, individual responsibility and what you might call collective responsibility. And I think that governors just, I'm not saying all governors, have not resorted to devices to temporarily balance budgets, but they've tended to, want to deal with these problems more than legislatures have.
Well, part of it,
and even though they want to be loved.
Well, yeah, they want to be, but part of it is they're the ones where the buck stops.
Yeah.
I mean, legislators, there's usually dozens, if not almost over 100 of them in every state, and so it's hard to pick one out and say you're the reason the state budget is in deficit. And they kind of go home to their district, whereas the governor always said, he used to tell legislators, he said, you guys are coming up with these screwy things, and you're going to go home, and I've got to try to make sense of them. But the governor is, I think, because he is or she is the governor, they're the ones, if the state doesn't work, that's who the public's going to blame. And that's the one who has the responsibility. So, and also a governor has a statewide perspective if they're doing their job right. And so that's going to be a lot more of, I think, a diverse point of view than if you're just very parochial representing a legislative district.
Well, okay, so basically, I would say when you look at representation and catering to people and helping people and providing access and, doing what people want and really reflecting their views, I mean, our legislatures are pretty good. The second job of legislatures, and the job we all think of, is making law, the lawmaking process. And that's much more difficult to kind of calculate. And I'm going to ask Jim in a minute to describe how good a job he thinks the Illinois legislature does at lawmaking from the point of view of having been in it for a couple of years and also, having worked with the legislature and watched the legislature for almost 20 years, from the executive branch. But it seems to me for lawmaking, to be done well, what it requires is sufficient study, that you know what you're doing. And not on all issues, but certainly on the major issues, on a lot of issues. It requires sufficient study. Study's got to go into it, and that's usually done by committees. Not always, but usually that's where study takes place. Secondly, I think it takes deliberation. And deliberation is kind of a back and forth argument for different points of view, trying to convince one another. And deliberation entails listening to one another, not just yakking at one another, but there's got to be genuine listening going on. Deliberation, it seems to me, is different than negotiation, but so you need the deliberation, you need the study. Negotiations obviously take place. Strategizing is always going on. And it's all part of building majority votes. What you need to come out with is a majority in the Senate, a majority in the House, and then you've got to get the governor to sign on or at least not veto the bill that's passed. So that's a process that involves individual legislators. It involves standing committees that should be expert in different policy areas. It involves the party caucuses and the role they play. It involves leadership. And when you think about it in terms of giving a grade, A, B, C, or D, I'd give the New Jersey legislature a C, okay? And I'll tell you why very briefly. I'd give the New Jersey legislature a C because they're not on task long enough. They don't work at it much. They spend most of their time in their districts, very little time in Trenton. The committees meet for too short a time. The New Jersey legislature is more interested in the outcome than the input. So deliberation study is less important than getting the votes to pass what the Democratic caucus, the majority party caucus, wants passed. So I think a lot of the deliberative parts and the study parts of the process are sacrificed to the results. They may come out with legislation that, you know, all the Democrats or all the Republicans like or whatever, but it isn't a process that I think does what a legislature should do. Now, with that as by way of introduction, how would you look at Illinois over quite a few years?
Well, I have to look over quite a few years. I mean, the last few years, Illinois state government's been a disaster. I mean, with our two governors, one in jail, one on his way, and we have really probably proportionally the largest budget deficit. We're probably worse than California, and I blame the legislature along with the governors on that. But one of the problems, and I'd give them at best a D right now, because they are, and one of the reasons, one of the big changes from when I was a legislator 30 years ago, and even when I was governor, which started 20 years ago, is that things are much more partisan in the legislature. So back when I first went over to Springfield as a legislative intern in the late 60s, very few issues were partisan, and I think that's true in most state legislatures. So you didn't have things being driven just by whatever party was in control, and everything had to, you know, whatever the leader decided that was the political thing to do. More things were dealt with on individual basis. And committees are important, but the more important to me than committees, you got to have 2 or 3 members in the legislature who are really experts in those areas. And back when you had a part-time legislature, you usually had experts, but they had a huge conflict of interest because the bankers who were in the legislature did the banking legislation. But they knew it. I mean, they knew what they were doing, but there was also that possible conflict of interest. Today, with full-time legislators, you don't have as many who, you know, have a full-time job someplace else. So they rely a lot on lobbyists, and there's nothing wrong with relying on lobbyists as long as you just don't let them write the bill. But that provides expertise that maybe members don't have because they now are full-time legislators. So I think the legislative branch of government could do a pretty good job if the partisanship didn't dominate so much now. Because when it didn't, there was a give and take. There was a dialogue, or, you know, you knew you had to compromise. I'm a great believer that the best pieces of legislation are legislations that come about from a compromise or from consensus. No one person usually has all the answers, no matter how smart they are in an issue. And you need to take time to get that input, whether from other members or from the lobbyist. And the lobbyists, they represent people too. It's just they don't represent them geographically. They represent them usually on a financial interest or a professional interest. So all that input, I think, is important. Too often today, it's purely a partisan vote. The minority party doesn't have much input because it's going to be a partisan roll call. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, I don't think that was as prevalent as it is today. And to me, that is one of the reasons I give the Illinois legislature, I think legislative bodies in general, a lower grade, because I think it's driven too much by partisanship on issues that shouldn't be partisan. I mean, most issues should not be partisan, particularly in the state legislature. There's not that much ideology involved in most of these issues, but they become partisan just because of maybe who the sponsor is or whatever, and I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think Jim has hit on sort of a major change that's taken place in American politics, and you can see it in Washington, and you can see it certainly in the large two-party competitive states. You don't see it as much in some of the smaller states or some of the one-party states. I'm going out next week, right after your exam, to Wyoming. And in Wyoming, you don't have this problem. And the reason you don't have the problem of partisanship in Wyoming is that there are very few Democrats in the legislature in Wyoming, and when there's very few of one party, they're not challenging the other party. You know, it doesn't matter. They're never going to win power. They're never going to take control of the legislature. In Maryland, it's okay to be a Republican because there are so few in the legislature. Then there are a few states like, Utah where, they can, tolerate Democrats, and Wyoming, and a number of states where they can tolerate, and Massachusetts where they're so, but in the states where the parties are competing, you've got a situation where the stakes are high. Ideology is more important today than it used to be. The parties are purer. Even the party bases, the people, the citizens are divided along party lines. It's not just party leaders who are inflicting ideology on people who want to be in the middle. There are a lot, the Tea Party is an example, not the only example of the liberal wing. So you've got competitive politics. Either side can win. The second thing that goes along with that, well, there are a number of things that go along with that. One is you've got partisan staffs, and the partisan staffs in legislatures just accentuate the partisanship. They find partisan issues where Jim might not find partisan issues, or I might not find partisan issues, but they can see partisanship where it might not really exist.
Now, my experience, and I came up through a partisan staff, and we had them in Illinois 35 years ago. I don't think that added to the partisanship in Illinois.
Okay.
I think the partisanship probably came more by the leaders wanting to make sure they had control of the chamber, because being the speaker is a lot better job than being the minority leader. Now, 35 years ago, a minority leader was still important. Today, because of this more partisan, where it's going to be our way or no way, you don't want to be the minority leader. So you spend all your time crafting all your legislative proposals to how can you get to be speaker. And again, that's a little different than I think I don't think the staffs brought that on, at least in Illinois.
What about this?
And actually, the staffs, we used to party together. Now today they wouldn't. They wouldn't be seen together. But back in my days, there weren't all that many staff, and we all got together at night.
I think the staffs did it, and I studied Wisconsin, the partisan staffs, the creation of partisan staffs, and in a sort of a political science article, tried to actually measure the increase in partisanship, and it came out there was an increase in partisan. I'm not saying it happens everywhere. The other point about partisanship is the nature of elections to the legislature have changed. 30, 40, or 50 years ago, elections used to be run outside of the legislature by the state or county political parties, by individual candidates. In the period, probably starting in California with Jess Unruh, the Speaker of the Assembly, Willie Brown, the election became the responsibility of the leadership. The leadership in the legislature took responsibility for getting their members reelected. And the members expected the leadership to do that, and the leadership was expected to raise the money and allocate the money to the competitive, to the marginal districts, and what have you. And along with that, you then get the leaders and the caucuses playing a role in in posturing to, have advantages in the elections in the legislature. For example, I don't know about Illinois, but in New Jersey, if you're a minority party member, if you're a Republican in the New Jersey legislature, and you're in a safe district, and if you can't be beaten, you'll be treated well. You'll get your bills passed and all of that. If you are a minority party Republican in a competitive district, you will get nothing, because anything you get may help you in your reelection. So basically, the election becomes part of the process. If you're in the minority, you want to get the majority voting on certain issues that might embarrass them. And it's a lot of jockeying in partisan terms. Add to that if the election becomes important in the chamber, what you're doing is you're identifying people on the other side of the aisle who you're targeting. The majority is targeting minority members, and the minority is targeting majority members. And that makes for more partisanship, because it's not only partisanship on issues, it's getting to be partisanship, on whether you retain your career in politics or your seat. Does that ring?
In Illinois, I'd say Republican, whether you're in a safe district or a swing district, have a difficulty getting a bill passed. It's become that kind of
that bad
in a lot of ways. Now, there's no doubt they might go after a certain member because they think he's vulnerable. But I'm not sure that no matter what bills you pass have all that much bearing on whether you're reelected.
No. But members want to get their bills passed.
But the point you made about the leaders, that again is to understand how legislatures work, is that leaders do raise most of the money now. When I first started out, and I worked for Senator Arrington, who was the Jesse Under of the Illinois, he brought the legislature in modern time, but one of the things he did was he created the Senate Republican Campaign Committee. It was the first of any of the caucuses that did that, and he raised not a huge amount, but he raised a pretty good amount, and that no doubt gave him more leverage when it came time who you're going to vote for leader. If here's a guy that you had to rely on to get your funding, chances are you're going to vote for him again when he ran. And also, if he told you to be for a bill or be against a bill, you probably, if you're going to go against him, you thought long and hard about that because you knew your next campaign you needed some campaign. So there's no doubt that's given the leaders a lot more control. And it's a lot easier for a leader to raise money than it is for an individual member because interest groups want to make a leader happy. One member, maybe that's out of 150 members, but there's only 4 leaders, and you want those guys on your side. So there's no doubt that has become a change in the process where leaders have so much more control over what happens in elections, and members know that, and so members are much more beholden to the leader. And I think that adds to why you don't see individual members on a lot of issues maybe vote with somebody in the other party if the leader is opposed to that, and things are much more partisan roll calls now, almost like it is in Congress, than it used to be. I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, and
leaders' power and money.
In Illinois, the standing committees were never very significant, as I recall.
In the Senate, they used
Gove's,
to be.
work.
But for the most part, you're correct, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know quite why, but that was the case. But what's happened around the country, in the large states, in the competitive party states, is that standing committees are less important than they used to be, and caucuses, the majority party caucus and the minority party caucus, are more important. And what that means is when you are in a standing committee, usually it's not a partisan operation, even in New Jersey. It tends to be minority party members can have influence. They may not get their names on bills, but they can influence the discussion if they don't get credit for it. And so that committee situation is a bipartisan situation. The two parties are represented. The majority party has more members of the committee, can dominate, but the two parties are represented. Once you move your bills from committee to caucus, you're dealing with a partisan situation. And the partisan elements become more important than the substantive elements very often, or they can become more important. Does that make any sense?
No, I would agree with that. I think, again, many pieces of legislation that really have nothing to do with ideology, they don't have anything to do with much of anything, all of a sudden they become partisan, much more than they used to. And you don't see the compromise or working together as much in committees as in Illinois. I mean, maybe 90% of the pieces of legislation were not partisan. So the leaders never interfered with what happened in committee. And even on the floor, the roll call would be split. I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell the Republicans and the Democrats by the roll call. That has slowly, at least in Illinois, has changed, where now almost every bill, the leaders, the staff comes in and says, these are the ones we're for, these are the ones we're against. And individual members, if they vote against their leaders' wishes, they do it at their risk because, again, they might not be as supportive the next time they run for re-election, or they may not get the committee assignment they want or the staff help they need. Now, I used to always tell members, that's when I was governor, not when I was the aide to the speaker when I was trying to get them to vote the way the speaker wanted, was that in the end, though, the leader needs you to be reelected, and he needs you to win your district. And so
he's got to give you the money.
Yeah, they got it. But there is this natural fear. You don't want to make the leader mad because the leader can do a lot of important things for you. And it's just some bill that you don't care that much about, maybe.
And you can see this, in Congress. But I think if you look at Congress, there are some ideological issues that really divide the parties. This is not just made up. I mean, the partisanship is based upon, not only each party wanting to win power, but it's based on some really principled differences between the parties.
But there's been a dramatic change in the two parties system in this country. When I started out, I always thought the genius of the American political two-party system is, here are the two parties. We overlapped. I mean, we never, I don't think, had liberal Republicans. Moderate Republicans were acceptable. And you had conservative Democrats. And those conservative Democrats were more conservative than moderate Republicans. Back when I was growing up, you had the Southern Democrats who were in control of Congress, and they were really conservative. But the two parties overlapped. And so ideology was not as clear between the two parties as they are today. And as a result, 20, 30 years ago, you had more compromise, you had more coalitions of Republicans and Democrats. I mean, the Civil Rights Bill passed with Northern Republicans or Republicans supporting Northern Democrats. I mean, Everett Dirksen, who was, viewed from Illinois as the Republican leader at that time, a very conservative guy, he provided the key votes for the Civil Rights Bill. You wouldn't see that happen today. It just would not happen, unfortunately.
In Congress, well, nationally, the major change was that the Republican Party gained representation in the South, and that all of the conservative Democrats who represented the South were replaced by Republicans. So, at least in the Democratic Party, you got rid. I mean, there was a kind of a abandonment of those conservative Democrats, and you had many more Republican conservatives coming in to represent the South. Now,
the other thing,
but what about in Illinois? Why is there an ideological shift in Illinois or in New Jersey as well, or is it just part of the national ideological shift? But I agree with you. It used to be nationally that there'd be an overlap between the two parties. Was there also an overlap in Illinois?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
But now there's less, right?
There's less, much less. And the part of the reason, I mean, to me, to understand at least Illinois politics and state politics and national politics, you got to understand primaries are where most people are elected. And unfortunately, a lot of folks don't vote in a primary. Who vote in primaries? Kind of the extremes, the true believers, as I call them. In the Republican primary, the far right disproportionately shows up in a primary. And they're going to have more influence than their numbers in a general election would warrant. And to some extent in the Democratic Party, it varies. But I think, so then you have in the general election, a lot of folks in the middle just shaking their heads. I don't have a choice, So, but for most elected officials, state legislators, particularly now that you have districts that are pretty gerrymandered and you have, safe Republican districts and safe Democrat districts, they just worry about the primary. And the primary is usually greatly influenced by the extremes in their parties. And so even though these elected officials may not be that extreme, how they vote often reflects that.
Yeah.
You trying to ask a question?
Oh, I just had one question. What's the implications of partisanship on the responsibility of the legislature? Is it making it more effective, or is it posing as an obstacle?
I think it makes it much more difficult to get the legislature to do the difficult things because politically this is not something they want to do. And the other problem is to do the tough things like raise a tax, cut spending. No one party wants to take all the blame. In Illinois, we never could do it with one party, and we always were pretty evenly divided, not quite as much in the last few years, but pretty evenly. And we'd always what we called a structured roll call. And you would sit down, the governor would sit down with the four leaders, and you would work out what had to be done, which maybe was a tax increase or, cut these programs. I mean, spending money and cutting taxes, you don't have to work too hard to do that. But to do the opposite, you have to work hard. And, there would be, on the Democratic side, they'd come up with their members who had safe districts and could vote for it. And the Republicans would come up with their safe members and they could vote for it. And both parties kind of shared the blame, but they didn't put their, targeted districts on the line on that. Now today, because it's so much more partisans, the minority party says, hey, you guys are in charge, you never talk to us, you never give us any input, so you guys go do it. Well, the majority party is sitting there, even if they want to do it, they probably can't get all their members to do the tough votes because they think it's political suicide. So that has caused, I think, a lot of legislatures not to do what they need to do, particularly in these tough times. I know that's very true in Illinois. We have not had two parties work together for a decade, and the state's in bad shape.
The only way you can get tough decisions made, I think, is if both parties go into the tank together.
Yeah, exactly.
They've got to share responsibility so neither party can get an electoral advantage in the next election. So there has to be a truce in order to, and that's the idea of the Deficit Reduction Commission, that was appointed. It isn't going to work, apparently, because, well, at the very least, the Republican congressional members aren't going to sign on. But you've got to have that. You've got to have that happen. Otherwise, what you will see, or what we are seeing, particularly in Washington, but I think in the larger states as well, is the minority party plays the role of opposition. And the function of the minority party, like the function of the British minority party in a parliamentary system, is to become the majority. That's the major job of the minority party. Not to cooperate, not to pass bills, not to do what maybe has to be done, but to become the majority party. So it's an electoral strategy, blame the majority party, and we'll go into the next election and win. If that continues, and if that happens, what we're going to see is a zigzag in control of government at the national level. The Democrats will be in, but they won't be able to produce. The Republicans will come in, they won't be able to produce. And it will be, I agree with you, of course, that it will be pretty tragic.
Yeah. And again, I guess the big negative ramification of this more partisanship is legislatures won't do the tough things they have to do. And you look across the country right now, most states are in really bad shape. And it's going to take tough decisions that most people aren't going to be happy with out there. And I'm afraid we're just not going to see them. Again, at least in Illinois, I know that's been the problem. We've had one-party control, and that one party, the Democrats haven't been able, for a variety of reasons, to do the things. And the Republicans' attitude is, well, hey, you guys are in control. We're not going to bail you out. We're not going to give you votes for a tax increase and things like that. So that we have basically a gridlock, just not doing anything. And that, I think, is unfortunate. And that, to me, is the biggest problem from this shift that we've seen. I'm not a great fan of parliamentary government. I mean, again, I've always loved what about our system when we had this overlap, because if you had a shift, if the Republicans won or the Democrats won, you didn't see the country take a big lunge to one side or the other. We kind of kept going down the middle. We maybe moved a little bit, but there was more stability. And I'm big on stability.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. It's just a personal predilection. But, yeah, I mean, you can't keep reversing policy. It doesn't pay. I saw this in watching a couple of states over the years. And policy reversals, let's take education. And this wasn't as a result of partisanship. In Florida, the legislature had a tradition of rotating leadership. Each top leader came in for 2 years and was leader for 2 years, and then the tradition was that the speaker designate took over. The next guy who had the votes took over. And in Florida, in both Senate and House leaders really took responsibility for education. So every leader who came in had a major education initiative, and governors are a little bit like this, we'll get to that, had a major education initiative. And consequently, you'd have a major education reform act passed. 2 years later, you'd have another major education reform act passed. 2 years later, you'd have another major education reform act passed. And legislation accretes. It doesn't, it doesn't get off the books unless it's taken off the books. And what you had were, the school people, the professional school people, the superintendents of education, the principals, the teachers, they didn't know what to do. None of this made any sense because it was constantly changing, and they couldn't constantly change. They were a little bit more like aircraft carriers. They just, took them a while to, come about. But that's what could happen with, Democrats for 2 years, Republicans for 2 years. You could get major changes in policy which can't be absorbed by the public or by the agencies that have to implement or administer policy. And I think it does make sense, particularly in the implementation stage, is to kind of, you work with it, you tweak it, you keep it going, you maintain the course. Because whatever the policy is, it isn't going to work in 1 year or 2 years. I mean, if you have education reform, you've got to give it years, if you can hope that it's going to work.
And the other thing is, no matter how good the proposal is, if it's a major policy thing, you're going to have to go back in a few years and make some alterations. And that's a tough thing to get legislators, or particularly if you're the sponsor of the bill, to say, gee, my great piece of legislation, there was a couple flaws in it. They don't like to do that. Legislatures back 30 years ago started putting sunset provisions in the legislation, and that was one of the arguments, is that you had to, review it or it went off the books. I don't know if that's ever been all that successful, but
very unsuccessful.
Yeah.
Because legislatures don't work by the numbers. They're not just going to do it that way.
But my experience was in Illinois, they just kind of renewed everything when it came out.
Yeah, they didn't want to
because it was established at that point.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, do you have any suggestions for how you get out of this? No. Yeah?
Well, I think one of the problems, I'll go back to primaries. We got to get more people voting in primaries. We got to get normal people voting in primaries, ordinary people voting in primaries, because we're letting the process be taken over by the extremes in both parties, and they are ideologues. And they do view a difference, and God bless them. They get out and work hard, and rain or snow. Primaries usually are, at least in Illinois, primaries, we have an early primary. I used to try to move it to the summer, because who cares in March in a primary? I mean, you care about basketball in Illinois in March. You don't care about a primary election. But those people who are very committed, almost fanatical, they will show up. They will work. But the average citizen just doesn't pay much attention to that. And they don't go vote in a primary. Now, some states like Illinois, you still got to declare, what party. And that's public record. We got a lot of folks don't want to be known as a Republican or a Democrat because it hurts their business. So I think if we could some way open up, get more people to vote in the primaries, I think then we might come up with candidates who are a little more representative of the general population than maybe the extremes of their parties. And I think that would maybe kind of slow down this ideological thing that's taking over state legislatures, much as Congress has been already taken over by, which I think is unfortunate, because most pieces of legislation at the state level are not based on ideology. They're just kind of common little simple things that have nothing to do with being a liberal or a conservative. So that's one of my...
Let me ask you, does it matter? This may, be more related to civility than partisanship, but partisanship and civility are tied together. Yeah. Partisanship is likely to make for less civility in legislatures. But if you think back to, when you were in the legislature or when you were working as a staff guy to Russ Arrington, did members get together socially more then? Did they get to know one another across the aisle. When you get to know one another as people, you're less likely to be, extremely partisan. You're more likely to be able to put yourself in that person's shoes and get his or her point of view. And those were the days, when lobbyists took legislators out to dinner, Republican legislators and Democratic legislators. That doesn't happen anymore in most states because of various ethics rules and, restrictions on gifts. And that was a time when, legislators did more drinking. It was a time when, they did more card playing. It was a very different era. Now, they do more working and, less drinking, and probably are more solitary than they are collegial.
They do more working, but they do it separate.
Sure.
There's no doubt. In fact, a few years ago, Ray LaHood, who was a congressman from Illinois that's now Secretary of Transportation, he was one of the Republicans, I guess, that Obama put in his cabinet. But he was...
The retreats.
The retreats. They were sponsoring these retreats to try to get, at the congressional level, Republicans and Democrats and their families together and get to know each other. Because in the old days, they used to all live in Washington. Nobody lives in Washington now. They commute and, they're always in their caucuses or whatever. And they're never on the House floor. They don't sit on the House floor. They only come in and vote. At the state legislature, members sit on the House floor, the Senate chambers, but they're divided by parties. In the committees was where we used to have the interplay. I remember I used to sit in committees, and I'd usually sit by Democrats, just, and you get to talking to them because you'd get bored listening to all the rhetoric in committee, and you'd get to know them. The other thing in Illinois we used to have were called legislative commissions, and when the legislature was not in session, which was a lot of the time back then, you had a joint committee between the House and the Senate of Republicans and Democrats, and they would meet usually around the state, which meant they were overnight someplace together, and they would socialize. And in Springfield back years ago, now I didn't drink or I didn't play cards, so I wasn't a very good legislator back then, but there was a lot more at night. Guys would go out and socialize, and they'd be at the same bar. And then they gave them a per diem, and they could all afford to go buy a condominium, and they just stayed in their condominium. But before, they used to all live in a hotel together. And that sounds kind of, that's not important. That's very important because, if you know people and you socialize with them, you're going to be less apt to misunderstand them, or you're going to be more apt to be able to work together. And that has disappeared at the state level, at least in Illinois, considerably over what it used to be. And they only kind of spend time with other Republicans or other Democrats. And that's all they hear. That's all they know. So when these guys on the other side of the aisle get up and say something, want to do something, they say, well, that doesn't make sense. We're not going to do that. So I think that's a real problem. And, I think there ought to be more attempts. I'm not saying we go back to go out and get drunk at night together or whatever, but there needs to be some way to get the two parties together. I'm a great believer the seating arrangements are very important. I'd love somebody to do a study sometime of where people sit in a legislative body and how that affects the output of that legislative body. I'm not sure you can ever get the Republicans and Democrats intermingled on the chambers, but in committees, and I'd move people around all the time, so you're forced to get to know other members in the legislature of your own party or of the other party even, because we always sit in the same spot. And again, that might sound like a minor thing, but in the state legislatures, you sit for hours in your seats in the chambers, and you know the people around you, but you may not know the guy 2 aisles apart or 2 rows from you very well. And so anyway, when I had power, which was limited, like at Secretary of State, I was head of the Secretary of State Association. I used to make sure every time we had a meeting, we had a different assigned seats, so you had to sit next to different people. We're not on the governors, but one of my gripes with the governor's conference was you go to the governor's meeting and you would always sit by the way your state was admitted to the union. So I always sat between Indiana and Maine. And 8 years, that's who I sat by. And we spent hours in those meetings and a lot of talking between us, but I never got to sit by the guys from the other state.
Did you ever tell Ray Chappelle?
Oh, I did. I used to complain all the time about when
he's here. He'll be here. Complain again.
But those little things, I think, are things that you might be able to, somebody pay attention to, and it might help begin to, I was a great believer in the state legislature, the national groups. Of course, I like to travel, the junkets. But I think they were very important because you get around other legislators from other states, you'd learn what's going on there, you'd see the similarities, you'd pick up some new ideas. But perhaps the most important thing was when we'd go to these meetings, Republicans and Democrats from the Illinois legislature would go to these meetings. They would be out of state, they'd be from Illinois, and there was this comradeship that developed that didn't develop back in Springfield because you were partisan then, you were split up, you were too busy. But when you'd go to these national meetings, you would be together. Often you'd sit together at dinners. Might be the only time you ever sat with a Democrat from Illinois was when you went out of state. And to this day, there are people in the Illinois legislature, there's still some left, or in government, who I used to go to those meetings with. Like John Cullerton, who's the senator. We used to go to council of state government things when I was governor and he was a legislator, but we'd get out of state and we were Illinoisans. We weren't Republicans or Democrats. So those kind of things sound minor, and you think that really shouldn't enter into public policy, but I think they're important in trying to create a little more togetherness among legislative bodies that we've lost in the last few years.
Yeah, all politics is personal. Just continuing this for a minute, you take these annual meetings, these national meetings of different legislative organizations. It's a great idea, but fewer and fewer legislators are going because it's politically dangerous to go, particularly if the meeting is in a nice place like San Diego or San Francisco, because then the fact that they went will be used by the campaign opponent against them. Now, let me just give you one story. I don't think you've heard this story, but some years ago there was a legislator in New Jersey, Bill Schluter, and he was a maverick Republican, a do-gooder type, who was punished by his party and given the chairmanship of the Joint Ethics Committee of the New Jersey legislature because nobody wants to be on the Ethics Committee. And Schluter liked it. And by virtue of being on the Ethics Committee, he was a member of a national organization, what is the name? COGL, Council of Governmental Ethics Laws. And these were, people who, did ethics one way or another, who were on commissions or in investigative agencies or in the legislature. And one year, the ethics COGL was meeting in Honolulu. And this is years ago. They were meeting in Honolulu. And I happened to be talking to Schluter on the phone. And I said to him, Bill, are you going to the meeting of COGL in Honolulu? And he said, oh, no, I couldn't go. I can't use state money to go there. Legislators used to get a travel allowance to go to a national meeting of an organization that was relevant to their work. I can't use state money to go there. No. I said, well, Bill, why can't you take it out of your campaign account? In most states, legislators have campaign accounts that can be used for anything, loosely connected to their campaign or, to their office. It can't be used for, buying a car or paying off your mortgage, but it can be used. So he could have used. He says, no, I can't use my campaign account. It would look bad. And then I finally said, well, Bill, you've got money. Why don't you just take it out of your pocket, pay, and go to Hawaii? And he said, that's a good idea. And he said, no, I couldn't do that. It would look bad. The point is, the public doesn't want to see you going anywhere that they can't go, whether you're paying out of state funds, out of a campaign account, or, it looks bad even if you're paying out of your own pocket. So it's very difficult. I was at the NCSL annual meeting in Louisville, just this past season, and I got approached by a camera crew for NBC. And I was trying to explain, and they were doing some story, and I knew whatever they were doing was going to be bad. And I tried my best to explain, why these meetings were useful. And they came out with their usual piece about, how people are, not attending the meetings or doing this or, and they had as an event, something at Churchill Downs. So they had a lot of camera stuff at Churchill Downs. And those events are awful, they're just terrible. Nobody would want to go. But, people seem to be having a good time. So that's all they had to get. They're having a good time, and the implication is nobody else is having a good time. So it's very difficult to get people together. Governor Edgar mentioned that Ray LaHood, along with a Democrat, David Skaggs, had started this retreat for new legislators, or for all legislators. And I was talking to actually Skaggs the other day, and Skaggs referred to it as a modest success, and hearing what had happened, I would call it a modest failure. Some members turned out the first year, fewer members turned out the second year, and hardly any members turned out for it the third year. And these were, retreats, but they didn't want to go, or, they didn't, there wasn't enough incentive to go. They were happy not to know their colleagues, particularly their colleagues in the other party.
There's just too much emphasis on you. If you're going to climb the ladder, it's going to be a partisan ladder, and you're going to, it doesn't do any good maybe to get along with the other guys. It might hurt you. And again, that's a change from when I started out 40 years ago in this business, and I think it's at the state level, particularly, it's unfortunate because I don't think it's necessary. Maybe at the federal level it's a little different, but at the state level, most of these issues, there's not a Republican or a Democratic side on this issue. Shouldn't be, and unfortunately, too much of that's become that way.
Let's not overdo this. This doesn't happen in all states. It tends to happen in the large, competitive party, professional legislature states. It happens, let's just name the states where it happens. It happens in New Jersey, it happens in New York. It doesn't happen in Massachusetts because there are just so few Republicans in the legislature, so it doesn't have to happen. It doesn't happen in Vermont because there are Republicans, but Vermont is different, probably because it's a small state and it's not a professionalized, it's a very citizen legislature. It happens in Texas, right?
Yeah, now, because back when I was NCSO, it didn't happen.
Because it was one party.
Yeah, you had
but now it's competitive.
Yeah.
So
Probably
it'll happen in places like Michigan. It will happen in Illinois.
Yeah.
It will, to some extent, it started to happen in Ohio more recently than in the other places. In Pennsylvania, certainly. So maybe in about a third of the states this is really going on, but it's certainly going on
with 2/3 of the state population. Yeah.
Yeah, a third of the states with 2/3 of the state population. Yeah. Anyway. So you don't think that the Illinois legislature does a great job in making public policy?
I don't think.
We'll get to the job of governors.
Yeah, I don't think they
later.
have recently because of this partisanship, and the one party rule has not been the norm in Illinois, and so I don't think they've quite figured out how to do that. We always were very evenly divided, and it's shifted much more to the Democrats, and they just haven't. And of course, part of it has to do, you got to have strong leadership coming from the governor's office to do some of these things, and that hadn't happened. So there's a tendency with the legislature, it's harder for them to organize themselves to do what has to be done without the governor being part of it. And that's, I think, is added to it. We've had a bad run on governors here. Not my time. I was a great governor, but since then we've had a bad run on governors. And, I think that's impacted the legislature's ability to do their job too.
Well, let's get questions, particularly for Edgar or for me. Basically on the legislature and its role, because then we'll take a break and we'll come back and spend most of the time on governors because, yeah, I've got all sorts of results that I want to, kind of bounce off Governor Edgar, and I think that would be also interesting because governors are the prime movers as far as policy is concerned, in our states, just as the president is the prime mover at the national level. So any questions before we take a break? Yeah.
When you were stating, when Professor Rosenthal asked you how you would resolve the partisanship, and you had mentioned voting in the primaries, could you just elaborate a little bit on that? Like, how would that?
Well, part of the problem is in the primaries today, at least my view of it, and I'm more familiar with the Republican primaries than Democratic primary. You've got this, the Tea Party, you've got the religious right, you've got these, what I would view much more conservative than the average Republican voter, who are very involved, and they get out. And a lot of folks don't vote in primaries, but they do. And for a lot of legislators in particular, that's where their election is. Their district is, the general election is a foregone conclusion. Whoever wins the primary is going to be elected. So what they worry about is their primary, and they worry about who votes in the primary. And so you have a tendency, I think, in both parties that you have what I call more the true believers, the really kind of hard line, this is the way it's got to be kind of thing. They're very important. So that makes it more difficult for that legislator who's elected maybe to reach across the aisle and work on a compromise because they're concerned about this small group, but a group that's very important in a primary that doesn't want to see compromise. I mean, it's kind of like, Sarah Palin's comment about where Republicans weren't elected to go work with President Obama. They were elected to oppose him. Well, that attitude is kind of growing in the state legislatures what it didn't used to be. I mean, the attitude, all right, you're in a minority, but, most of these problems aren't Republican-Democrat problems. Well, today, it's being viewed much more partisan than it used to be, and I think it's driven by these ideologues on both sides that really don't want compromise, and that's fine. I mean, they're entitled to that, and I respect their determination to be out there and be active. I just wish people in the middle, where I think most folks are, who would like to see compromise, who don't think things ought to be all black and white or red and blue, I guess is the colors we now use about the two parties, but they don't vote in the primary. So their points of view is not as important, even though there might be more of them. So that's why I think more participation in the primary would, I think, help maybe, it's not going to completely turn this around, but I think it would slow down this kind of polarization that we're seeing in American politics, which I think is detrimental. I mean, again, I have always thought one of the geniuses of our system was this overlapping, and, we weren't polarized as much. I'm a believer in the two-party system, mainly because I think you ought to have a check and balance, and voters ought to have a choice on Election Day. I'm not so much that we ought to have 2 points of view as we ought to have two different candidates. And I got to tell you, someone who ran for office was pretty successful. I knew they were going to run somebody against me, so I better watch myself. I better, not do something that was going to be questionable. So I think two-party system is very important, but I think we've got to the point now where we've polarized. And Congress has happened, I think, earlier, particularly in the House. The Senate now, too. One of the reasons I didn't want to run is I didn't want to put up with that. I mean, I'd been around it long enough. I just wanted to, if it had been the club, when the U.S. Senate, it didn't matter if you were a Republican, Democrat, they all went after session and had a drink together and kind of worked things out. I might have gone then. But now it's so partisan in the Senate like it is in the House. And that is, unfortunately, as I said, has spread to the state legislatures. And again, I think the primaries are one of the ways maybe that has happened, and one way we can get around that if more people would vote in primaries.
Any other? Yeah.
You mentioned before how a lot of state legislatures, how if you associate with the other party members, how you're often that's a taboo. Is that like universally applied? I mean, does that happen to a lot of legislatures?
No, I mean not so much. I mean, you might, if you go out and have dinner with them, they're not going to throw you out of your caucus, but you just don't think about doing that. Now, if you vote with them a lot, then you're going to run into troubles. But even if you vote with them a few times, there was a bill up in the Illinois legislature last night. I was at the airport and I got a call from a state senator who used to be my chief of staff and who lost the governor's primary by 170 votes. If he'd been governor today. I mean, he'd be the governor after January if he'd have won that primary. But anyway, there was an issue up and he was going to go against his party, basically. There were going to be two of them, but he'd promised me, and it's not a partisan issue, but it's one of those issues that has become partisan. And but oh yeah, the issue was gaming and horse racing. I would have been excited to go to Churchill Down. I'm a big horse racing guy, but it wasn't. It's not. And a lot of Republicans voted for it, but their leader was trying to hold it up to get a trade-off on something else, which I understand that too, but they do that on every bill now. And so what happens? Nothing happens. And, in this case, if this hadn't happened, it doesn't happen, the industry, the horse racing industry in Illinois probably won't exist in another year or two. So, and it's not a great bill. I mean, it's a lot of flaws, but it's better than nothing. And the problem, though, is if, you might really feel strong about this. But if your members in your caucus, if you do that very often, then you're going to get ostracized. Again, 30 years ago in most state legislatures, today where it's very partisan, that wasn't true. You saw, split votes. I mean, Republicans and Democrats would be on both sides on a lot of issues like that, and you don't see that as much today.
Well, I mean, look at the health care bill in the United States Senate and just look at Olympia Snow. Mm-hmm. Or actually, there were about 8 Republicans in the Senate that were willing to kind of look into the health care legislation and that were working on the Finance Committee to kind of craft something that would be satisfactory to the Republicans as well as to the Democrats. Olympia Snow, being one of them. And basically, they kind of agreed that if they couldn't stand together, none of them could go. And when they went home to their districts, to their states, during that course, they heard from people back home. So that was the first. They heard from people back home, and several of them, Grassley, for example, from Iowa, broke off. Others broke off. Olympia Snow from Maine continued, to kind of tantalize the Democrats with the possibility that she would agree. And they kept doing whatever she wanted. They kept, agreeing to her requests for this, for that, for the other thing. But finally, she too, couldn't go ahead. She couldn't go ahead because she would be the only Republican out there, and she couldn't do that. I'm not sure whether she would have faced real opposition among Maine Republicans. I don't think they're quite as vehement or conservative in Maine, but she certainly wouldn't have been, made her colleagues in the Senate happy. So it happens. I don't think it happens on many occasions in many places. It doesn't have to happen often, because if you're a member of a party, you don't want to alienate your party colleagues. There are no great incentives to do that.
That's something else to understand. The power of the caucus. It's not just because the leader's got money and he can give you. There is this feeling, I want to be part of the group. I mean, I don't know how many of you. I always said most of these people are very reasonable folks, and they go off to the state capitol, and it's kind of like going off to college and getting in a fraternity. You do some goofy things when you all get together. And individually, you're pretty good. But there's this feeling that I want to be part of that. I don't want to be an outsider in my caucus. I want to belong. And I used to have problems when I was governor with Republicans in the Senate. Their leader, who was much more conservative than I was, and I'd go to these members, and they really agreed with me. In fact, their district, it made sense. And it wasn't so much their leader was going to withhold money. They just didn't want to go back to their caucus, which was their club, and say, I'm not with you guys. I mean, that just really bothered them. And so that influences a lot of what happens, particularly in state legislatures. I can't speak for Congress, but in state legislatures, it does influence what they do. And today, because those caucuses are more powerful, they meet more often, it's more your it's the club you belong to. It's not the Senate or the House. You belong to the House Republican caucus, kind of. And you don't want to, let those people down. You want to be, I'm sure you have done that yourself on things. But that attitude has a lot to do with why things happen in legislative bodies. It's not, again, it's not something you necessarily read in a textbook, but that's why it happens. One thing, we've been kind of negative on state legislature. They do play a very positive role. I mean, you can have a terrible governor and you need a legislature to keep him in check, as we saw in Illinois. A legislature does represent their constituents. And folks ought to be represented. People ought to have their point of view. Now, they might be wrong, and that shouldn't prevail as public policy, but they need to represent them. And I think legislatures do that, and I think they are a very important check on a rogue governor. It's just, I think they have I think their potential is a lot greater than what we've seen in the last few years.
As we were talking earlier about representation and legislators representing their constituents' interests, would you say, and that they want to be liked and they want to, they more or less represent what they want more than what they need. Would you say in Illinois, or in your own personal experience as a legislator, were you advocating for them as a trustee or as a delegate?
It's been a while since I remember the definition of a delegate and a trustee. I think I was from that district, so I shared a lot of their values, and so a lot of things were natural. There were certain things. I mean, I was peculiar a little bit as a downstate Republican. I was pro-choice. I was pretty sympathetic to Chicago. A lot of things that's not typical for a downstate. That's a rural, basically, area of Illinois, Republican. But on the majority of the things, people could relate to me that, hey, I grew up in this district, and I was, family man, all these things that they kind of cared about. So they'd let me kind of wander on some issues. And I have a definition. We're not in to talk about leadership, but my definition of leadership is convincing folks to go where they don't want to go. And so you're representing them, but there are times you're going to have to kind of lead them to an area maybe they don't really want to go, but they need to be there. It's best for them long term. And maybe that's more true for an executive position than a legislative position, but I think even legislators, if they do their job right, if they represent their folks, then they've got a few votes they can make that maybe their district might say, well, I don't agree with that, but I agree with most everything else he does, and he's a good person, and I'm not going to. You're not going to lose over one vote. I mean, even voting in Illinois, the third rail of Illinois politics has always been perceived as being for an income tax increase. I don't think that's ever beat anybody in an election. You cannot prove to me that it ever beat anybody, particularly a legislator who's voted for it.
But in a general election, you're talking. What about a primary?
A primary, still can't find anybody that lost in a primary.
Because of one vote.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that affects legislative races today that didn't, they call them mailers. And one thing you've done, all of a sudden you'll see these mailing, because it used to be, you'd run ads in newspapers, on radio, television. Today, direct mails are much more used, and also with cable and all, you can kind of zero your message in. And there's more money, so you can spend more money on advertising, and it's much more negative. So members do worry about, some votes that they're going to just get inundated. But I still don't believe there's ever been one vote outside of maybe. Back when I was a legislator, we had a legislative pay raise passed after the election, about 2 weeks after President Carter had put a wage price freeze in the United States.
And you voted for that?
I voted for that, but I'd campaigned for that. I'd said that. Now, I did leave the legislature about 2 months later. They never got a chance. But there were some legislators that got beat.
Yeah.
About 3 around Peoria, because the Peoria paper.
Pay raise is very bad.
Yeah. The Peoria paper, that's the only time, though. We had a lot of. The Peoria paper ran their pictures for the next year and a half until the next election, every day on their editorial pages. These guys had voted for this pay raise. And now I went in and saw it, because I then got appointed Secretary of State a couple of years later, and I went in there and they said, now you voted for that pay raise. And I said, yes, and you look, and I said before the election I was for the pay raise. They didn't say another word. But, that's the only thing I can think of. Now, if you do that several times, then I think you might have a problem. I mean, you can't use up, but I
But the
think there are
major
times.
point is that there aren't that many times
Yeah, no.
when legislators are out of sync with their districts. Yeah, pay raise is a little different. Those kinds of issues, yes. But, in terms of the big issues, the hot button issues, they generally, they think the way the majority of their constituents who have voted for them think.
Yeah, I mean, they believe that.
They believe.
Now, there's sometimes unfortunately, there's more times than they probably should, they'll go against their conscience because they're worried about not so much getting beat, they just don't want to be harassed. Because they go to these meetings and people, sometimes legislators will get excited and get 3 phone calls on a bill. Now today you get emails, but emails you get millions of emails. But still, if somebody stops them at a function and says, "Hey, I don't like this idea," they don't get that many personal contacts on a variety of bills. I mean, when I was a legislator, I might have only got contacted on less than 5% of the bills I voted on, and of that 5%, probably there's only 5 or 6 I got more than 20 pieces of mail on. Now that was before email. Today it's a lot easier. You get emails, they can, send them out. But I would remember when I got letters on. I'd remember particularly if somebody grabbed me at an event and said something about a bill. At least you made sure you knew why you were voting against what people maybe wanted back in your district if you were doing that. But for the most part, most of these issues don't generate that much of interest on the part of the electorate. And unfortunately, a lot of them have become partisan issues that shouldn't have been.
All right, why don't we take a 10-minute break? The way I'd like to do this is to sort of, kind of get out the results of my study of governors, which, I'm just finishing up. And when I started, when I decided to write about governors, I immediately called up Jim Edgar, and he was kind enough to talk to me for a full day about his governorships in Illinois. And what I think would be useful is, let me just say, what I'm going to lay out here is the governor and his policy leadership, and how governors succeed at being policy leaders. And what I mean by policy leadership, I mean leading on public policy initiatives that governors have, and on the budget, which is the major document that has to be enacted into law on an annual or biennial basis, depending upon the state. And the budget is where resources are allocated. I'm going to talk about let me just see if I... Okay, what I think the best way to do it is to talk about this in terms of the chapters that I'm going to be presenting this material in. And I'm going to start out talking about the essential powers that the governor has, the constitutional and political situation that governors in different states have. Secondly, I want to talk about what governors find when they get sworn in, the situations with which governors have to deal. Thirdly, I want to talk about what governors bring by way of personal experience and personal assets to policy leadership, the characteristics of governors, the personal qualities that feed into success. Fourth, I want to talk about how they formulate the agendas they come up with. You know, how they decide what they're going to push for and what they're not going to push for. Fifth, I want to talk about how they get what they want from the legislature, what they do by way of campaigns. And then sixth, I want to talk about what they accomplish. And seventh, I want to talk about why governors have a record of success. All right, let's just start with the powers that the governor has, and you know what the governor's advantage. It seems to me that the major advantage of governors over legislatures is simple, and it's the fact that governors are one and legislatures are many. There's one governor, there are two houses, there are 40 members of the Assembly, 80 members of the Senate. There are Democrats, there are Republicans, a majority and a minority. But the governor is one. And being one means that the governor decides. The governor consults, the governor listens, the governor studies, the governor does all of this, but then the governor decides, and that is the governor's program. Now, the governor can change the program as he or she goes along. The governor can compromise, but the governor has the initiative. The governor has the initiative. The governor has the initiative, constitutionally, but I think physically by being one, the governor has the initiative, but also constitutionally by Constitution specifying that the governor shall deliver messages to the legislature. Constitutionally, that the governor shall, formulate the budget, as the governor does in about 40 out of the 50 states. So basically, the governor has this power of the initiative. Now, when I surveyed governors, sent them a mail survey, MAIL survey, there were 75 former governors who responded. I'm basically looking at the modern governor. So what I've been doing is looking at governors who served in office in the 50 states since 1980. There are about 275 of those people who are alive today who have served. I didn't try to interview sitting governors because they're very difficult to get hold of, and
they don't tell the truth anyway.
What they say would be suspect because they've got too much riding on not saying things. So there were about 275 governors. 75 responded to this survey. I've interviewed another 25 governors, and I've read memoirs and biographies of probably another 25 or so governors. So I've touched upon, one way or another, about 125 governors who have served, in most of the states. I didn't get, I got a governor from New York, but I touched probably on governors from virtually all of the states. In this survey, I asked governors about initiation of policies. And I asked them, who initiated, you or the legislature, policies that were the major policies passed in your state during your administration. Now, you got to recognize there may be some exaggeration by governors. And there's no way to discern that, but I don't think it's too much. Basically, 72% of the governors responding, said that they initiated all or most of the major policies that were passed during their administrations. only 24%, about a quarter of the governors said that the legislature and the governors initiated about an equal number of the major policies, and about 4% said that the legislature actually initiated most of the major policies. Now, how does that strike you, the kind of initiation thing
I think
of major policies?
Again, I mean, as far as Illinois, I would say that at least 90 to 95% came from the governor. And that's not to say that we got everything done.
No, that's a different question.
Yeah, but they came from us.
But the point I'm making is the governor being one, the governor initiates the major stuff. Not only is the governor one, but the governor has the constitutional requirement to initiate. So yes, the governor initiates. Another power of the governor is that the governor can reward and punish legislators. And I guess the basic, punishment that the governor has, and it's not only a punishment, but it's a tool, is the veto. The veto and the line item veto or the conditional veto. But to be able to veto a bill is to really, and to have that veto can only be overruled by a 2/3 vote. That is a very significant weapon. The threat of a veto, threatening to veto, gives the governor the advantage in bargaining. I mean, wouldn't you say the veto is
It does. It's not, I mean, you probably, if it's an important piece of legislation, you're probably not going to veto it or sign it just because you're either happy or unhappy with that legislator. But that legislator knows you've got the final say. And it's amazing how nice they get to be to you once they get the bill passed, and they know the only thing between them having this bill that they can say, I got it done, is you. They're a lot nicer to you. Now, in Illinois, it's the only state in the union where the governor not only has these veto power, he can rewrite the bill. He has an amendatory veto power, which is completely, we've used it far out of what was the intent, but we've had it upheld in court. You can take a bill and rewrite it. And so the members know you have that option too. Now, interesting, they don't usually care too much because they just want a bill. But the veto is a power. I wouldn't say it was the main leverage I had, but in this day and age when you don't have jobs anymore, you can't give out contracts that easy anymore, it is one of the things you do have that fortunately they haven't taken away from you.
But I mean, there are other powers too. I mean, the power to appoint people to boards and commissions. Legislators want to get appointments for constituents, for important constituents, for deserving constituents. And the governor in Illinois and in many states has many appointments. In New Jersey, there are skiddy million appointments. And that is a power to reward. And it doesn't take much to ingratiate yourself with legislators. An appointment would be fine.
Appointment. Back on the veto, I forgot really the most important power or leverage I had on them, not whether I was going to sign the bill, but they wanted a bill signing ceremony.
Okay.
Because that gives them publicity.
Okay.
And that was the biggest leverage we probably had with these guys, because they really had to be nice to us for me to do a bill signing ceremony. And if they really were nice to me, I would go to their district.
Yeah.
Now that was, and I was a legislative liaison for Governor Thompson. I remember when the legislative session got over and all the bills were on his desk and I reviewed them all, I mean, all of a sudden legislators who wouldn't talk to me during the session now became my best friends because they knew I was the guy that was going to talk to the governor, not only would he veto or sign the bill, but more importantly in many cases, would he do a bill signing ceremony or would he even come to their district? Because that gave him that publicity that was so important. So the appointments, I mean, they'd have somebody who's important to them. Sometimes you had to worry about being their brother-in-law, something like that. But, that helped him out. And the governor, the appointment power of the governor, I think, is one of the most important powers that probably doesn't get much attention when people look at how well is a governor done. What do you expect from this governor? I mean, look at who he appoints, because a governor's only as good as the people around him. And the folks he appoints, whether it's to his staff or to these boards and commissions, who have a lot of power. Many of these boards and commissions, they run universities, they have huge economic powers, very important appointments. And the kind of people the governor names to those boards and commission, I think is a good indication of what kind of governor you've got, whether the governor's a good governor or not. But, you know, you don't name, just because some legislator wants you to name somebody to something, you don't do it unless the guy's qualified. But there's a lot of people qualified out there. And so if the guy's qualified and you can pick up a favor from a legislator, you probably would do that.
Yeah. And I had mentioned here, you get recognition and you can bestow recognition and attention. That's the bill signing, that's visiting the district, that's doing any of that stuff. Campaign assistance. Governors can come to fundraisers. That helps. And many other things, but governors they primarily reward. They don't have to punish because people, know that they have the veto or the line item or the amended.
The campaign thing for me was probably the best leverage I had on the legislature. Fortunately, when I was governor, my approval rating was always pretty high. And in many of their districts, particularly Republicans, I didn't go in and do any Democrats, but in Republican districts, my name recognition, my approval rating was usually higher than the legislator. And that gave me leverage with them because they wanted me to come and do a fundraiser for them. Because if you get the governor in, people with money will show up. They also want me, more importantly, they want me to do commercials for them. Because again, I was more popular in many cases than they were, better known because you're the governor. So that was a very important tool I had to kind of keep them in line. Many times I don't think they liked me, but they knew that people liked me more than they liked them in their district, so they had to get along with me. And I always felt as governor, I had an obligation to help members of my party, but I would be selective. There were times when I would just tell the leaders, I know I'm not going to help that guy. I'm just definitely going into a fundraiser. That was very selective on that. That's my time. But doing the commercials, my last year as governor, I wasn't running, and they came to me with a list of people they wanted me to do endorsements and do commercials for. I had more fun. I just marked off about 5 of them. I said, no way. Those guys have lied to me. They've never been there. I'm not doing a commercial for them. And I have to say, I didn't get quite that bold until I was leaving, because I always hoped maybe if I did it, maybe they'd get a little better. But at that point, they couldn't do any good for me, and I'd put up with them for so long. But what this all revolves around is the governor is so visible in the state. People know who the governor is. Most people don't know who the legislators are. We have Speaker Mike Madigan, who's been Speaker now since the
25, 30
no, more
years,
than that.
30 years. Yeah.
See, at least, 30 years, about 30 years. Longest, most powerful guy really in Springfield. His daughter is now the Attorney General. Her name's Madigan. Most people, if you say Mike Madigan, they think you're talking about the Attorney General, who's not, Attorney Generals aren't that big of news items, but there are bigger news items than the Speaker of the House, who's been the longest Speaker forever, most powerful guy by far in the legislature, but still people don't even know him. So the governor, even if you're a bad governor, people know who you are. I can assure you, Rod Blagojevich had great name recognition in Illinois, and he was the guy that tried to sell the Senate seat. I mean, he was terrible, but he's the governor, and that's what people think of when they think of state government. And that visibility that Alan was talking about earlier is huge for a governor. It's more important than his constitutional powers, really.
Yeah, and this gives the governor, being statewide, being visible, gives the governor the bully pulpit.
Yeah.
I mean, the governor can get through the media. No legislator can get through the media as easy, can command the attention of the media. So when the governor is pushing an issue, whatever the issue, the governor has that ability to get through to the public, to get through to various groups. The governor, as an individual, can lead a campaign. not to go over the head of the legislature, not to go around the legislature, but very often just to support a position in the legislature that the legislature wants encouragement for. So the governor, as one, can lead the campaign, the governor can bestow favors, the governor can threaten, the governor can make life happy, make life miserable. The governor's advantage is, that I've seen since I've been, studying legislatures, the governor's advantage over the legislature is just enormous, enormous.
Well, I'd much rather be governor than a legislator. The bully pulpit thing, it is a huge tool. And often I would go to the public. And I could go to the public because if the governor shows up in any city in Illinois outside of Chicago, you're going to be the lead story on the evening television. You're going to be the front page story in the newspaper. Now in Chicago, it's different. There, it's the mayor, and the governor's second. But if you're in a fight with the mayor, which I often was with Mayor Daley, because I told him no, and he just didn't understand that, you would get coverage. But by far, you're the most visible person in state government. And many times I would want to do something, raise a tax or make a change in something, cut a budget. My first year, I had to cut billions out of the budget. And I went to the public through the media, because I could command the media, and kind of forced the legislature to go along with me. The media is such an important tool, because if you get to the media, and the legislators know you've got the media, you're in the media, they know their constituents are hearing your message, they're going to be much more apt to follow you, because in the end, it's their constituents. And if their constituents are listening to the governor, and the governor is connected on his message, then the legislators are not going to keep fighting the governor. So it's a very important tool to the governor to be successful in the legislative process, that he or she gets that message out and goes to the public. Now, there are times the legislature wants you to do that because they want to be for something, but they want the public to know that you're pushing it and you're for it. And also, you get the blame if they don't like it. They'll vote for it. But also, I have to say, more times than not, we went to the media to force the legislature to finally follow, because they're very reluctant, particularly on tough things. As I said, the first year I was governor in 1991, the state had the biggest deficit it ever had in the history, and then we had a recession hit and all these things, so I had to just cut and cut and cut. Well, they weren't used to that. Republicans didn't like it any more than Democrats did. And I had to raise a tax. But I went to the public after I had every lobby group in the state outside my office protesting. I had demonstrators, but I went out around the state, and because wherever I went, the media gave me coverage and told my story. In the end, my story prevailed, and I got pretty much everything I wanted in the cuts and the tax increase in that year. And I was a freshman governor dealing with a Democratic-controlled legislature that was not happy that I was the governor. Not because I was a Republican ideology, it was because they had a redistricting map they had passed, and they knew I was going to veto it, and I did. But again, that just cannot stress enough that bully pulpit, how important that is for a governor. And for a governor to be successful, he has to use the bully pulpit. If he fails to use the bully pulpit, I don't think he can really be that successful on bringing about major change in public policy.
So we start out with the enormous advantages that the governor has. The second thing let me confront is, what governors bring with them personally. What attributes, do they have? Some governors, can have won elections by wide margins, and they can, claim that they've got a mandate. Other governors won by narrowly. They may claim a mandate. I think what is most important is and let me put it this way, most governors, not all of them, are very able individuals. You don't get to be governor without being able. You're screened out along the way. These are competent people. I mean, I've talked to any number of these people, and they are very sharp people. And there are some who aren't, but they are exceptions, not the rules. So you start out, these are able people. The second thing about them is most of them are pragmatic people. They're not the ideologues, most of them. They're not to the left. They're not way to the right. But they want to get things done. They want to make a record. So you've got the pragmatism, you've got the general skills and abilities, and most of them, have had electoral office, which helps. Not all of them. About half of them, have come from the legislature. And that advantages them. It's no guarantee, but it advantages them. What disadvantages them is some big city mayors are disadvantaged when they get to the legislature because they're used to being the chief when they get to be governor. They're used to having a very weak city council. And I'm thinking of William Donald Schaefer in Maryland as an example. You have a weak city council, you've dominated the city council, you get to Annapolis and you're going to run roughshod over the legislature. Not a good way to start out. The other, kind of bad experience for governors, I would say, is being a prosecutor, a U.S. prosecutor, a state attorney, but to have that orientation that you're right, everybody else is wrong, indict, convict. An example of a prosecutor as governor, and it is not the right mentality, but he seems to be working it, is Chris Christie, our current governor. Very able prosecutor, but has taken that mentality into his dealings with the legislature, rigid, a bully, and what have you. According to my findings generally, Chris Christie should not be successful because if he maintains this course, it just shouldn't work. Now, maybe he will be the exception that proves the rule, maybe he'll change course, or maybe my rule, or what I see as a rule, is wrong. So far, Chris Christie has been successful in his leadership of the legislature. But to be a legislator, what you've got is you understand issues, you're familiar with issues, you're familiar with state government, you get familiar, and if you're on the budget committee, you're really familiar with state government. You understand the process. You make friends. You've got friends in the legislature. That helps when you want to deal with the legislature. And mostly, not all, not, let's say, Jim Florio, maybe not others, that I can think of, you gain respect for the legislature and the legislative process. You may be critical, but you gain respect. And I think it's important for governors, in terms of them succeeding, to have that kind of basic respect. Some do it without it, but mostly it seems to help. So you've got this sense of respect. You recognize that the legislature is an independent branch of government. And you recognize also you take responsibility. And, I found this out by talking to them through the surveys, but as a governor, you take responsibility for leading. Governors think they should initiate. That's the role of governor. Very few governors, and I can think of Harry Hughes in Maryland, really think that it's the legislature's job as the first branch of government. But most governors think that they should initiate. And then finally, in terms of what they bring to office, most governors bring very able staffs to office. They may not be large staffs. It depends on the state. Smaller states, governors have smaller staffs. But governors usually bring to deal with the legislature people who are former and respected legislators or people who have been on the staff of legislators. John Corzine made a mistake. He had no legislative experience, and he brought to office at the beginning people who didn't know the legislature. Later on, he brought in people who did know the legislature. But most governors, even if their former legislators bring legislative, sophisticated people to be their legislative director, their legislative liaison, or whatever it's called in the various governors' offices. So my argument would be that, and you've met governors, you know, governor to governor. My argument is that these are very able people, and they're generally pragmatic, and a lot of them have the advantage of knowing the, quote, enemy, as it were.
I thought when I went to my first NGA meeting, the National Governors Association, and we'd sit, particularly when we sit in private, I thought it was the smartest group of people I've ever been with in my life, myself excluded. I didn't think I was quite up to all this, but small state, big state, I think you're 100% right. I mean, folks who get to the governor's chair, for the most part, are very competent, very bright people. And I found that at the NGA. I mean, I used to marvel at how bright these folks were. Didn't agree with them all the time. Got tired of listening to some of them talk all the time. Some of them loved to talk a lot. But they all were very bright people. The governor's office, the comments you made about the governor wants to get things done, you do, because if you don't, you're the guy blamed for it. I mean, you're responsible. The legislature, kind of, as I said earlier, they wander off home, and you're the governor. People know who the governor is. They don't know who the legislators are, but they know who the governor is, and you're the one, if paychecks don't get sent out, if there's a disaster, whatever, you're the one responsible. And so you've got to make sure the state government continues to function. You've got to make sure that the budget's done properly. You've got to make sure agencies are run by competent people. And if not, you're the person held responsible. So I think just the nature of people who run for office and get elected governor, they're doers, but if they weren't, they better be, because if you don't, you're going to be in big trouble. One of the advantages the governor has once they're there, to get to be governor in most states, that's a very visible race. So even if you haven't held an office before, by the time you're elected governor, you get sworn in as governor, people know who you are. Now, I had the advantage because people like to have a feel about the governor. Not so much is he a liberal or conservative or even a Republican or Democrat, just something about him as a person. That still drives most people in their opinion of elected officials, is what kind of person is it? And when I ran for governor, I'd been Secretary of State for 10 years in Illinois. Now, in Illinois, the Secretary of State's an elected office. You're the motor vehicle administrator. Anybody to get a driver's license, you come to the Secretary of State's office. You don't go to someplace in the governor's. And it's run pretty well because my name was plastered all over the place, and you wanted to make sure people had a pretty good experience. A license plate, state librarian. It's a very visible office. So for 10 years, I had been Secretary of State, so people had kind of developed an opinion and a feel for me, that as a person, which I think is the only reason I won the election, because I shouldn't have won that election. It was not a Republican year. And I won it, barely, but I won it. And I was for a tax increase, which was kind of a crazy thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, but politically it was kind of crazy. But the fact that they knew me and they had an opinion of me overcame partisan objections or whatever. And I'll tell you this one other story, that just if you ever run for office. Also, the 10 years I was Secretary of State, traffic safety was my big issue. It's when we were doing drunk driving legislation, and a group called MAD had been started, and I was very much in the national forefront on that. But as a result, there was this radio program on the biggest radio station in Illinois, in the Midwest, WGN, a guy named Bob Collins, and he had me on his program. Probably that 10 years I was Secretary of State, this is no exaggeration, I was on over 100 times. And he was morning, drive time, prime time. Most listened to guy in the Midwest. Wasn't political, but he wanted to talk about traffic safety, drunk driving, and issues like that, and we'd talk about other things. I mean, people thought I was a regular. I thought maybe it was the Collins Edgar show. But what happened because of that, particularly in the northern part of the state where I wasn't from, in the suburbs, which is hard to campaign in, get to be known, people would listen to me on this show every morning. And this guy was extremely popular, and he was my friend. He had me on. People got to know me. And to this day, most people who know me in Illinois in the suburban area at least, where I'm not from, they know me because of this one radio program, because they got to know me as a person. They know my grandkids. There's a joke in Illinois that they call my oldest grandson Coyote. His name is Dakota, but this jockey, this radio person now, used to joke and call him Coyote. So this day I'll run into people and say, how's Coyote doing? Well, Coyote is now 15 years old and he's doing fine. But again, that's something that I had a chance to do. It's not something, it wasn't political, but people got to know you. And it just underscored, and I always thought the key to my success politically was I was on that radio program. Not television, a radio program. But people got to know you. And they didn't want to know you as a politician. They didn't care about this liberal conservative stuff, most of them. They just wanted to know, what kind of person are you? You got kids, what do you think about this and that? And that carried me through a lot, my 8 years as governor. I continue to be on this program, needless to say. But that carried me through a lot of controversy, unpopular proposals I would make. But people knew me and trusted me. And they knew me because they got to know me on this radio program. So again, that's something that I think any governor has the opportunity to get that kind of visibility, and he needs to connect then with the public in a personal way. And that personal connection really will go a long way in getting support for you when you're out there trying to get things done that aren't that popular. And so last point, you talked about governors bring good staff. I think I said earlier, you're only as good in an executive position as the people around you. You've got to have good folks. No governor who's successful can micromanage. Any who tries is going to fail. You've got to be able to delegate, but you've got to delegate to folks you trust and people that are competent. You have to set the parameters, but the day-to-day running of state agencies are by these directors. And I was fortunate I had good people, but one of the reasons I had good people was, at least in a large state, people kind of want to work for the governor. It's considered a prized job. I went through about 3 different chief counsels, my main lawyer, and I got high-quality attorneys out of Chicago who would come and serve because it was great for their resume to say they had worked for the governor. And so as governor, you have the ability, I think, to bring in some of the best and the brightest. And you want to bring them in. You need their ideas, you need their enthusiasm, but you also have to set the parameters, not micromanage. So I think all the things that Alan has talked about are correct. The one exception I'd have to say, in Illinois at least, my predecessor, Jim Thompson, was a U.S. attorney who sent politicians to jail. And people were really, this guy's going to be, and he'd never been in elected office. He was a natural at politics. I mean, too much. In fact, he liked it too much, and I think he cut too many deals he shouldn't have cut, just to cut a deal. But he was not adversarial. If anything, he gave to the legislature. So it was different than what you've seen here. I think if he'd have been that way, I don't think he would have been successful. I agree with you on that point.
And Dick Thornburg in Pennsylvania was a U.S. attorney and in the Justice Department, and he came in, and he wasn't chummy with legislators, but he respected them. He managed.
Thompson,
and he had sent a couple of them to jail.
Yeah, Thompson was more chummy with them, almost to a fault. Now I will argue a little bit.
You can be chummy or not chummy. It works either way.
But one of the things I would argue, a legislator coming into the executive branch, it's good to have that legislative knowledge, but it's completely different being in an executive branch than being a legislator. And the person who succeeded me, George Ryan, who's now unfortunately in jail, he was still a legislator as governor, and that's not the right attitude. I mean, he loved to cut a deal. He didn't have a clue what the deal was. He never did when he was speaker either. But he just liked to that's kind of the legislator, and he wanted to make everybody happy, and that's what got him in trouble. But sometimes a legislator mentality is the wrong mentality as governor. Now, the knowledge of the legislature is very important, and the relationships, but you've got to shift, and some legislators have a hard time shifting to being a chief executive. Also, I might say businessmen have a hard time. CEOs have a real hard time coming into government and as a governor and adjusting. First of all, they got to deal with the legislature. They've never had to deal with their board of directors. They're not anything like a legislature. Like a mayor has a little bit of trouble too. You've got to, and then everything's public, and they're not used to that now. CEOs maybe are getting used to that, but you know, it's just a completely different environment. And I'll stop. I'm rambling here a little bit.
No.
The last, but you hear people say, "Well, we got to run government like a business." You can't run government like a business. They have different bottom lines. Government's bottom line is to provide service. Business bottom line is to make a profit. Now, there are things in business, there are techniques that you can put into government, but you can't run government like it's a business. They're just different things, entities. And I get so tired, I'd hear guys say, we got to run this like a business. I said, well, you run it like a business, it ain't going to function. It's not rational anyway, and you've got to adapt. Now, there are techniques in business you can use. There's no doubt there's some managerial skills and things like that, but in the end, you can't run government like a business. You're there to provide services. A business is there to make money. And if you start running a government like it's to make money, then you're going to not provide the services, and there are folks who are going to slip through the cracks, and some are going to die. So anyway, even for a Republican, I want to throw that in.
Okay, so on the second dimension, you know, the personal qualities, you know, these governors are pretty able people, and if they've been through the legislative process, they've got a lot of useful knowledge and maybe some friends. So they've got advantages. Now, thirdly, and this relates to their pragmatism, is that they immediately adjust their agenda, what they hope to accomplish. Now, their agenda comes, and we'll talk about this, from any number of things, but they immediately adjust to what I would call the political realities or the economic realities of life. And the most important reality is the economy. The economy, if the economy is bad, if revenues aren't coming in, that's going to shape or help shape the kinds of agenda items they have. They won't be able to spend if the economy is terrible. So you look at governors today, you look at the new Republican governors coming in, what they do is going to be dictated largely by economic circumstances. Now, connected to that, at least in a small way, is, and it's interesting, probably, and of the governors that I surveyed, about 80% of them had been governor under either bad economic circumstances or mixed economic circumstances. There were only maybe 20% who said that they had been governor maybe for 4 years or even for 8, where the economy was generally good. So governors, are going to, have to relate to what the economy is like and what they have to do by way of their budgets. The second thing is that probably 2/3 of the governors indicate, and I believe this because of the way life goes and governors go, that they come in and they're handed a deficit by their predecessors. Governors in their last years tend to spend down, and so the new governor comes in. Not only does he have to get a budget together very quickly, but he's generally left with a deficit. So right off the get-go, a lot of the governor's agenda is shaped by the deficit that he or she inherits and the economy. And the second major thing that the governor finds is whether his party is in control of the legislature, whether the other party is in control of the legislature, or whether the legislature is a split legislature. Now, my argument is, being pragmatist, being political, I think what's not recognized is that we're not dealing with things that sit. This process is always taking place. You think of a governor's agenda being enunciated in the State of the State address. I don't buy that. I think the agenda is always in formulation, and it depends on circumstances and other things. But the major things that, or two of the major items that go into the agenda are the economic situation, the deficit situation, and party control of the legislature. If you have your own party control of the legislature, you might have somewhat different agenda than if you've got as Jim Edgar has to deal with a Democratic legislature. So governors start shaping their agenda depending upon political and economic realities. So they're not just, going to shoot for pie in the sky. They shoot for what is politically, obtainable for the most part. I'm not saying they never try for something they can't get. They do. But for the most part, they're going after stuff that seems within their grasp. Respond.
Well, first, I agree with most everything you said.
Because you said it first when I interviewed you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you listened.
Yeah.
I'm glad you listened when you came to see me.
Proving I listened.
Since I bought you dinner that one night.
If you hadn't,
Yeah,
if you hadn't bought me dinner, this would be entirely
That's
different.
Right, I understand.
Yeah.
When you run for office, I used to get so sick. Everybody says, "What's your vision? What's your vision?" Visions are the phoniest things I've ever seen in a campaign. You think up visions to keep all the pundits happy and everybody. Because as Alan said, when you get elected governor, what you do is react to one crisis after another. I was Secretary of State in Illinois. It's a big office. I could kind of pick and choose. One time I could fight a war on drunk driving. Another time I created a literacy program and did this stuff. I didn't have to deal with crisis. As governor, I dealt with one crisis after another. Now, in the campaign, everybody wanted to know, what's your vision? What's your vision? As I said, and we'd have campaign rhetoric. We'd talk about things in an election. When you get in office, that all goes out the window. First of all, nobody talked about when I ran for office, the state was bankrupt. We didn't know it till I got in and looked at the books. We were bankrupts. So it didn't matter if I'd had a vision. We couldn't do anything but try to get the ship afloat, the budget, which is the most important thing you deal with. The other big issue I had to deal with the first term I was governor, we had the greatest natural disaster we'd ever had in the history of Illinois. We had huge floods on the Illinois and Mississippi River. And contrary to what the media said, the president's not responsible for dealing with the disaster. It's the governor. And if the governor doesn't respond, then things are really messed up. And we had to respond to that. Now, we didn't talk in the campaign about what are you going to do about getting a bankrupt state softened again, which mainly is cutting. We didn't talk about how you handle a natural disaster. But that's what I had to deal with, two important things I had to deal with the first 3-4 years I was governor.
Even legislatively you were dealing with.
Well, I had the budget, the budget was huge.
The
I mean, I had legislators who had never said no to anybody. That's why we were in the problem. This was before a recession. That's why we were in the problem we were in. We had a governor who was going out of office, who was tired of fighting, and he just agreed to everything. And now I want to point out for the record, just if I don't get a chance, when I left office 8 years later, I left the largest budget surplus in the history of the state to my successor, who promptly spent it all in the first year, and the state then went into deficit. But anyway, so we had to deal with those crises. And the other thing about a governor, to me, that's critical, and that's why this vision thing I used to just really get mad about, a governor has to manage. And now people say, well, we want more than a manager, we want a leader. Well, let me tell you, if you don't manage, you can't lead. And I think, again, too often in a campaign, when the media is looking at candidates and people are talking about it, they don't think about, can this guy manage? Can he run the state? Doesn't mean he might have great ideas. He might have all kinds of great ideas that aren't going anyplace. You can't afford. But can he manage the state? And that, to me, is the most important skill. Now, if he can manage, hopefully he can also lead, too. He can convince you to maybe do some things, and he has some intriguing new ideas or whatever. But first, he's got to manage. And too often, we overlook that. And I think too often, the governor never manages, and everything, no matter how well he talks and how many visions he has, things don't happen. Last thing about the legislature. I had a Democratic-controlled legislature, I had a Republican-controlled legislature, and I had a split legislature. The split legislature was the best. Now, the Republican legislature was all right for a short time because there were about 4 or 5 things I wanted to get done I never could get done, like Chicago school reform, because Chicago Democratic legislators would never allow Chicago school reform because the teachers' union is so important to them. Now, privately, they agreed with what we wanted to do, but they wouldn't vote for it. Even Mayor Daley, who now takes credit for it, came down and opposed it, but secretly wanted us to pass it. And we could pass that. Well, 2 years later, I wanted to raise taxes again for education. I couldn't have done that with a Republican-controlled legislature. I had a split legislature, and it took me a while, but I finally got it done. So each type of legislature gives you a different opportunity. And as Alan said, you can't do all things you want to do. And you can't be all things to all people. You've got to prioritize. And also, you've got to timing. Timing is critical. There were certain things I could do with a mixed legislature, and there were certain things I could do with an all-Republican legislature. I couldn't have done the tax increase. I couldn't have done some of the things I wanted to do with an all-Republican legislature. I couldn't have done the Chicago school reform with a mixed legislature or a Democratic legislature. So you got to prioritize, and timing is critical. The first 4 years, I couldn't do anything but just try to keep the state from, going bankrupt and then having to deal with a flood. The next 4 years, I got reelected by the largest margin in the history of the state after the first time barely winning. So I had a little more of a mandate, though I got to tell you, that lasts for about 30 days. And then it doesn't matter if you won by $1 billion or you're the governor and they don't like you and they're going to give you a hard time. But you picked your time and place. So timing is very important too, I think, in being successful. But don't spend so much time worrying about the governor's or the candidate's vision. Try to figure out, can this guy manage anything?
Yeah, and most of the governors that I've, studied, they have policy ideas. These people have been in politics for the most part, and even if they have policy. So they come to office with policy ideas. But most of them also are pragmatic, and they kind of organize those policy ideas, so that they can get them through, depending upon the situation, the economic, fiscal, and political situation. I'll get you in a second, okay? So so it's not that they're devoid of policy ideas. They have values, they have policy ideas, and they want to work on education, or they want to work on transportation, or whatever it is. And the other thing that goes into the formulation of their agenda is they consult. I mean, very often what they do is they establish advisory commissions or blue ribbon commissions, partly to come up with ideas and partly to sell the ideas that the governor already knows that they're going to come up with. So the campaign gets underway as a kind of agenda is in the formulative stages. Governors consult with legislative leaders. They consult with leaders who have the majority in the legislature, and the leaders will tell them this will fly, this won't fly. They may not go by that, or very often they come together with common agendas, that there are things that they agree on. But they listen. They consult, they listen, and their agenda comes out of that too. And then they, subject the whatever they have to staff analysis. I mean, Dick Thornburg in Pennsylvania was very good on that. He sent any ideas that he might want to ship out. He sent them to the legal staff to see if they were constitutional. He sent them to the political staff to see if they would fly politically. He sent them to the media staff to see if they would be, and he sent them to the legislative staff. So they are pragmatically developing their agendas. Yeah?
Mr. Ergen, you said that being able to manage is often more important than the vision, but as a citizen who's just watching the news, how do you tell who is the best manager? How?
Well, I think, first of all, is the state spending within their budget? Our service has been delivered. I mean, we talk a lot about legislative policy and what goes on, and that's important and that's fun. But an awful lot of what the governor does is manage those state agencies. It's not so much creating policy as it is delivering services. And that's where most people come in contact with state government. They don't go down and watch the legislature, and they go to some state agency to get a driver's license, or they need help on maybe they're on public aid, or there's a public health issue or whatever. They go to those agencies. Or they drive on roads and they need to make sure the roads are good. So that to me is how you. Now I have to say the media doesn't spend much time looking at that, until maybe there's a crisis, and but even sometimes they miss the crisis. I just think those are important things to look at in measuring how successful a governor is. Now, you've got to have some ideas, and I will say that I don't think many governors have any original ideas, and there aren't many original ideas. We get them from each other, and that's fine. And timing, again, is very important. But as I'm saying, it for a governor versus a legislator, that ability to manage and make sure he has managerial skills, that he's got people out there and the agencies are doing what they're supposed to do and people are getting the services they're paying for, that to me is extremely important in how successful a governor is.
Yeah,
You had a question earlier
yeah.
too. I mean,
Well, let me
okay.
just hold off because we don't have much.
She had one a long time ago.
Okay,
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to get back to what you were saying first of all about the veto as sort of used as a weapon. And I was wondering how often governors would veto a bill and would that obviously hurt their approval rating?
They veto a lot of bills, but these are minor bills that they just don't approve of. So they do veto a lot of bills, but many governors, instead of vetoing a bill, they call a legislator in and say, I can't sign this bill unless you change it this way. So they do. Some governors veto more than others. There was a governor in New Mexico.
New Mexico vetoed.
Yeah, I mean, Gary Johnson, he vetoed half of the bills passed, but he was very
different.
out of sync with the running of government. That's the way he ran it. I think the more successful governors use the veto judiciously. Governors who have an opposition legislature are more likely to veto. Let me just
just quickly, you tried during the legislative process to get them to change the bill so you don't have to veto. You don't want to veto a bill, but if they don't, then you got to veto it every once in a while because that sends a message. You will veto. And I remember, and there are some big bills. I had to veto the one for aid for parochial schools. And I don't believe I'm a big public school person. And the cardinal called me from Chicago and talked to me. And I said, fortunately I wasn't Catholic, so I didn't have to quite worry too much about the cardinal. But he was a friend of mine. We talked, and I said no, and I vetoed it. Now, I don't know if it hurt me in the public committee. The cardinal didn't talk to me for 10 years. He now talks to me again. But that's because he didn't like the last governor, so he talked to me again. But no, you try not to have to get to a position where you have to veto. You'd much rather have them change the bill before it gets to you. But if you do veto it, you do send a message to the legislature. Even if it's opposition party controls, they don't usually have enough to override you on a veto.
So basically, in formulating an agenda or a budget, governors are pragmatic. They take into account all these things. Now, it's kind of interesting when I ask governors the kinds of issues on their agendas during their tenures as governors. 92% of the governors, and basically their agendas are generally limited. Most governors concentrate on no more than 3 or 4 or 5 issues in any legislative session. So if they serve in, so they might have over the course of 8 years, maybe 20 issues that are on their agenda, other than their budgets, which are always agenda items. So they're focused. They have to focus. They believe in focusing. Now, Mario Cuomo in New York never focused. Mario Cuomo would have 200 or 300 items on the agenda, and very few of them got anywhere because the legislature didn't know what was important and what was unimportant. But most governors recognize you focus. And when I asked governors what were on their agenda, and we coded them by different policy areas, 92% of the governors all had education as a priority item, okay? Listen, 69% of the governors all had the economy and economic development as a priority item, and 47% had the environment and energy as priority items. So what we're dealing with here, particularly in economic development and education, we're dealing with the bread and butter items of state government. Education, first of all, is important. It's important to economic development. It's important in its own right. It's a popular area in terms of what the public thinks is important. It's where all the money goes, or most of the money goes, so it's important. It's visible, so it's important. It's what I call bread and butter. Economic development, if you don't grow the economy and you don't provide jobs, you don't have jobs for people getting out of schools and out of colleges. So, and you don't have revenues coming in, to provide for other state services. So these are two, obvious areas where governors focus. So what you have here, and what was never mentioned, were the hot button issues. No governor who responded had abortion or right to life on his or her agenda. None of them had civil unions or gay rights. None of them had capital punishment. I think there were 2 mentions of having legislation having to do with guns, but that's as close as it got to them. Those issues arise, but they arise from within the legislature. And then governors may back them, or may have to get involved, because if those issues get to their desks, they either sign or veto them. But those issues come from legislative initiatives, not from gubernatorial initiatives. Governors do the bread and butter stuff of government, where the money is and where the needs are. This is really the business of the state. It's not sexy stuff, but it's obviously the important stuff. Now, am I crazy about this?
No, I mean, and one of the things I like to tell students at U of I when I talk to them is good government is not exciting, it's dull. And that's why the media doesn't cover good government. They usually cover
bad
scandals and
government,
that thing. But good government is somewhat dull, but you got to keep your mind on it. Education, definitely. One of the reasons is state government is responsible for education. It's not the federal government, even though they're a lot more involved than they used to be. And it's not really local government, because local government's the creature of state government. And it's also very popular with people. Now, I have to correct you a little bit.
Good.
All the money isn't going to education these days. It's going to health care, something called Medicaid. And that's not popular. Yeah. And that's not something you go out and win many votes talking about. I mean, you spend most of your time trying to figure out how do we stop spending so much money on Medicaid so I can spend more money on education or some of these other things. But education is a priority, and it's also very popular with the people. So whether you're a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat, education is usually your number one priority. But I have to say, you have to spend almost as much time now on health care, particularly Medicaid funding issues. Economic development, and again, that's a popular thing. Everybody's for job creation. I think state government's a little limited on what they can do on job creation. You're at the mercy, particularly large states like Illinois, at the mercy of the national economy to a great extent. I think the best thing you can do for economic development as governor is run a good state. Mm-hmm. Yeah, do the basic things of state: education, transportation, public safety, quality of life. Those are things that'll attract jobs and people that are going to hire. Because one of the things CEOs used to tell me, we don't get so hung up about the tax rate as we do just the education skills of the workers. We try to recruit people into Illinois. We've got to have a place for them to live that's safe. They've got good recreation facilities. I mean, not that they're going to go out and spend a lot of money on recreation facilities, but all those things are important, I think, in economic development. Just as important as giving tax breaks that usually go to companies that'll run the first time they get a better offer from another state. But that's kind of my bias showing through. But I have to tell you, there's only one issue that really, to me, the number one issue is not it's the budget. And particularly in the day and age we're in now, that's got to be the number one issue for the governor. Because if the governor doesn't take care of the budget, nobody's going to. It's just not in the nature of the legislature to keep a budget in line and make it. So all these other things are important, and some of them are fun to talk about, but the budget has got to be the major concern. At least that's how I viewed it. And the legislature kind of knew that I cared about the budget, so they'd trade off with me.
And governors can, at least the governors told me in the survey and in my interviews, they pretty much control the budget. I mean, they get most, if not all, of what they want in the
But you
budget.
do, but you had to struggle to do
legislate-
it. You had to struggle to do it, though.
Yeah, and the legislature's, impact on the budget is very marginal, very much around there. So governors, okay, just to sum up, because I got to let the governor go, and the governor will go. We'll stay for 10 minutes while I'll get your papers, and you can ask me any questions about next week. Basically, to sum up, in looking at how successful governors are on the budget or on policy, and the definition of success is, do they get pretty much what they go after? Not do they solve the problems of the state, because no governor solves the problems of the state. Not successful in terms of doing what you like, because different people like different things. But do they get out of the legislature much of what they go after? And the answer is they get an extraordinary, just like Edgar in Illinois, and I'm not putting down Edgar in Illinois, but other governors do well too. They get an extraordinary amount of what they go after. And they get an extraordinary amount of what they go after in the budget. This doesn't mean that they go after, solving the fiscal problems, but what they get what they ask for, a lot of what they ask for. The other question is what they ask for the right thing? That I didn't. So governors are successful. And they're successful because they have the inherent power, because of the nature of the office, because of the skills they bring to the office with them, the able staffs they have. They're successful because they're pragmatists and can take into account circumstances. Then they're successful because they get into the day-to-day campaign and strategizing that gets the last few votes, if necessary, for things to go through the legislature. They're successful because they're dealing with policies that are important, and there's going to be some resolution on them in the legislature. So I concluded by, governors may not be world shakers. I maybe you would disagree with this, but I think of governors, and this is a compliment, and you might think of it as a compliment too, as caretakers, rather than, as people who transform government. I see their role as they do it, and probably in my eyes as they should do it, as taking care of the state for the next generation or the next governor, and taking good care of it, and putting it in shape for the future. Caretaking is, to me, important. All the vision and razzle-dazzle is less important. And the title of my book is going to come from your remarks and the repetition of your remarks that I heard since talking to governors. And the title of the book is The Best Job in Politics: How Governors Succeed as Policy Leaders. You get the last word.
Well, I look forward to reading the book. And being a governor is the best job in American politics. I mean, you can get something done. You don't have to kill yourself to get there. Like I think running for president is just insane. You can have an impact on people, and to me, that's why you go in the public service. And you don't have to be governor, but you could be just working a state agency and have an impact and maybe make the difference on someone's life. But as governor, it's multiplied 1,000, 1,000,000 times. So it's a great job. The one thing I would say, the governor does have the tool. The governor is successful, but the governor is only successful if the governor recognizes he's not going to get 100% of what he wants. The key is to know when you've got to give a little. And that was hard for me sometimes to know just when to give and when not. I think it is for any governor. But the legislature's got to have a little bit of input. They've got to have a little bit. I used to always put an education budget in, and I always had a little low because I always knew they were going to add to it. And that was all right because I always had a little money in the back because I knew I had to let them add to it. If I'd have started out at the top, they still wanted to add to it. So I'd always start out a little bit low. And you got to recognize that you're going to get most of what you want, 75% of what you want. If you hold out for 100%, you may get nothing. So I think a good governor understands that. And the governor has to respect the legislative institution and the rest of governmental institution, be it local government or whatever. Governor can't get too carried away with his job approval rating or how he won the last election. You gotta, because that can all change pretty quickly, as President Obama has found. That can change overnight almost. So, but again, it's a great job. It was a great opportunity. And I think governors are successful, and I hope you're all successful in whatever your careers might be. And it's good being with you.
Okay, thank you.